At 08:14 on the morning of September 18th, 1944, heavy rain began to fall on the burning ruins of Arnhem. While other men in the 2nd Parachute Battalion clutched their machine guns and prayed for a miracle, Major Diggby Tatham Wart stood calmly in the middle of the street. He wasn't holding a weapon. He was holding a cane umbrella. 60 yards away, a German armored vehicle turned the corner. Its machine guns were leveled at the British positions. Its armor was thick enough to shrug off rifle fire like raindrops. The men in Digby's platoon froze. They were trapped, outgunned, and about to be overrun. But Diggby didn't retreat. He didn't call for a medic. He simply opened his umbrella, stepped out from cover, and began to walk toward the tank. His commanding officer had called him a damn fool for carrying it. The chaplain had called it absurd, but in the next 30 seconds, that fool was about to do something that physics and sanity said was impossible. He was about to use a 14 O's piece of silk and wood to disable a war machine built to conquer Europe. To understand the umbrella, you have to understand the man. Diggby Tatham Wart was not a normal soldier. Born in 1917, he was educated at Sandhurst, the elite military academy. But Diggby had a problem that could get a man killed in the high-stakes chaos of airborne warfare. He couldn't remember passwords. In the confusion of battle, forgetting the challenge and response code meant getting shot by your own sentries. Diggby needed a solution. He needed an identifier so distinct, so undeniably British, that no German infiltrator would ever dare copy it. His solution weighed 14-0. It had a cane handle and a black silk canopy. When Diggby arrived at the staging area for Operation Market Garden, the other officers were loading up on ammunition and grenades. A standard British paratrooper carried 65 lb of gear. Diggby packed a bowler hat and his umbrella. The mockery was instant. One lieutenant asked if Diggby planned to have tea with the Germans. The battalion commander, a man who would become a legend in his own right, looked at the umbrella and asked if it was standard issue. Diggby replied calmly, "My goodness, sir, what if it rains?" They laughed. For 6 weeks leading up to the invasion, the umbrella was the punchline of the Messal. They called it Digby's toy. They called him the dandy of the airborne. But Diggby knew something they didn't. He knew that when the sky filled with parachutes and the ground erupted in mortar fire, sanity would vanish. In that chaos, men wouldn't look for a rank on a shoulder. They would look for a symbol. They would look for the man calm enough to carry an umbrella into a hurricane. On September 17th, 1944, the laughing stopped. The plan was audacious. Operation Market Garden. Field Marshal Montgomery's gamble to end the war by Christmas. 35,000 paratroopers would drop behind enemy lines in the EAD Netherlands. They would capture key bridges and pave a carpet of airborne troops for the tanks to cross the Rye River and march into Germany. Digby's unit, a company of the 2nd Battalion, had the hardest job of all. They were the tip of the spear. Their target was the road bridge at Arnhem. Intelligence reports were optimistic. They said the Germans in Arnhem were old men and boys. They said the panzer divisions had retreated to Germany. They said it would be a walkover. Intelligence was wrong, dead wrong. Waiting in the tree lines around Arnhem were not old men. Hiding under the camouflage nets were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, battle-hardened veterans of the Russian front. They had tanks, they had half-tracks, and they were resting exactly where Diggby was about to land. At 14:00 hours on Sunday, September 17th, the green light flashed inside Digby's transport plane. He didn't scream. He didn't psych himself up. He adjusted his bowler hat, hooked his umbrella over his left arm, and stepped out into the void. The drop was deceptively peaceful. Diggby landed in a field 7 mi west of the bridge. While other men struggled to untangle their chutes, Diggby stood up, dusted off his uniform, and unfurled his umbrella. He used it to point out positions, directing his men to secure the hedge. The men of a company saw the umbrella. They smiled. The tension broke. If the major was crazy enough to wave that thing around, maybe things would be okay. But the silence didn't last. By 15:30, the radios failed. The dense Dutch forests blocked the signals. The battalion was cut off from high command. They were blind. Diggby was ordered to lead a company toward the bridge. 7 miles of enemy territory. The first sign of trouble came at 16 hours. A reconnaissance jeep squadron sped ahead to capture the bridge early. Minutes later, the sound of tearing canvas and exploding metal echoed through the woods. The jeeps had run headfirst into a blocking line set up by the SS. The road to the bridge was shut tight. The old men and boys were actually SS cadets armed with machine guns that fired 1-200 rounds per minute. Diggby didn't panic. He moved a company off the main road and into the backyards and gardens of the Dutch houses. This was urban warfare now, house to house, garden to garden. And leading them through the fences was a man with an umbrella. At 17:15, a German machine gun opened fire from a second-story window. The lead platoon was pinned down. Dirt kicked up into their faces. The snap of supersonic bullets forced heads down. Diggby walked forward. He didn't crawl. He walked. He raised the umbrella, pointing it at the window like a sword. He shouted over the roar of the gunfire. "Don't worry about the bullets. They've got no rhythm. It was insanity, but it worked." Seeing their commander strolling through fire shamed the men into action. They flanked the house, kicked in the door, and silenced the gun. But as the sun began to set on September 17th, the reality of their situation became terrifyingly clear. They weren't fighting a disorganized retreat. They were walking into a trap. By dusk, a company had fought its way through 3 German blocking lines. They were exhausted. They were low on water, but they were closing in on the bridge. At 20:30, they reached the northern ramp. It was a massive steel structure dominating the skyline. They set up defensive positions in the houses overlooking the ramp. Diggby took command of a sector near the riverbank. They waited for the rest of the division. They waited for the tanks of XXX Corps to come up the highway, but nobody came. Instead, at 03 hours in the morning, they heard a sound that every soldier in World War II had learned to fear: the squeal of unoiled tracks, the deep, guttural rumble of a heavy engine. It wasn't a truck. It wasn't a half-track. The SS had deployed armor. Diggby was inspecting his perimeter when a young private, eyes wide with terror, grabbed his arm. "Sir, there are tanks. We have no anti-tank guns." "What do we do?" Diggby looked at the boy. He looked at the looming shape of the German armor moving through the smoke. He looked down at the umbrella in his hand. "Do," Diggby said, adjusting his grip on the cane handle. "We make them terribly uncomfortable." He wasn't joking. Diggby had realized something crucial about tanks in close-quarters urban combat. They were blind, buttoned up, looking through tiny slits. A tank commander could barely see 10 yards in front of him. A tank was a dragon, but even a dragon has eyes that can be poked out. Dawn broke on September 18th with a fury of mortar fire. The British were surrounded. 700 paratroopers holding a few houses against 2 entire SS Panzer divisions. The Germans held the south end of the bridge. They held the town. They held the roads. The British held the umbrella. The mockery of the training camps was gone. Now the umbrella was the only thing keeping morale alive. Whenever a mortar shell screamed in, Diggby would pop the umbrella open and cover his head. "Don't worry, chaps," he'd say as shrapnel pinged off the cobblestones. "I've got it covered." It was funny. It was heroic. But it was about to get deadly serious because at no odd hours the Germans stopped sending infantry. They realized the paratroopers were too stubborn to dig out with rifles. So they sent the heavy metal. A column of armored cars and half-tracks began to roll across the bridge. Their orders were simple. Crush the British. Flatten the houses. Leave no survivors. Diggby watched them come. He stood in a doorway, the umbrella hooked on his belt. He touched the brim of his bowler hat. He turned to his radio operator. "Tell the colonel to hold fire. Let them get close. Let them get right under our noses." The lead armored car rumbled forward. 50 yards, 40 yard. It was a beast of steel and machine guns. Diggby stepped out of the doorway. He didn't have a bazooka. He didn't have a launcher. He had an umbrella. And he was about to do the craziest thing in the history of the British Army. The lead armored car rumbled forward, its engine growling like a trapped animal in the narrow Dutch street. The machine gunner in the turret swung his barrel left and right, looking for targets. He didn't see the man in the doorway. He didn't see the umbrella. Diggby Tatham Wart waited until the vehicle was less than 10 yards away. The ground shook beneath his boots. The smell of exhaust fumes filled the air. This was the moment. If he moved too early, the machine gun would cut him in half. If he moved too late, the car would crush him against the brickwork. He moved. Diggby sprinted from the doorway, closing the distance in 3 long strides. He wasn't running away. He was running alongside the beast. The German driver, peering through a narrow vision slit, had a limited field of view. He saw the street ahead. He saw the burning rubble, but he didn't see the British officer running in his blind spot. Diggby reached the side of the vehicle. He climbed up onto the fender. It was an act of lunacy. A man with a cane umbrella riding a 20-to-9 war machine. With a smooth, practiced motion, Diggby thrust the steel tip of his umbrella through the driver's vision slit. Inside the armored car, chaos erupted. The driver, suddenly blinded by a foreign object jamming his viewport, panicked. He slammed on the brakes and jerked the steering wheel hard to the left. The vehicle swerved violently, its tracks screeching against the cobblestones. It smashed into a wall, the engine stalling with a grinding crunch. The machine gunner in the turret tried to spin around, but he was too slow. Diggby had already jumped off, landing gracefully on the pavement. He signaled to his men. A Pat anti-tank team leaned out of a second-story window and fired. The hollow charge projectile struck the immobilized vehicle, cracking its armor and silencing the gun. Diggby dusted off his jacket. He checked his umbrella for damage. The tip was bent, but the silk was intact. He looked at his stunned platoon sergeant and said, "Useful things, umbrellas. Keeps the sun out of your eyes." But there was no time to celebrate. The disabled car was just the first wave. Behind it, the roar of more engines signaled the arrival of the main SS force. The battle for Arnhem Bridge had truly begun. For the next 3 days, the world shrank down to a single square mile of burning buildings and shattered glass. The paratroopers were cut off. They were surrounded by 2 panzer divisions. They had no resupply, no air support, and their numbers were dropping by the hour. But in the center of this hell, Diggby Tatham Wart became a myth. He seemed immune to fear. As the German mortar barges intensified, turning the streets into a meat grinder of shrapnel and stone, Diggby continued to visit his men at their posts. He walked upright. He refused to wear a helmet. He wore his maroon beret, tilting it at a jaunty angle, and carried his umbrella as if he were strolling through Hyde Park on a Sunday afternoon. On the second day of the siege, the shelling became so intense that the buildings themselves began to collapse. The noise was deafening, a constant rhythmic pounding that drove men to the brink of insanity. During one particularly heavy barrage, the battalion chaplain, Father Egan, was crouching in a cellar trying to comfort the wounded. He looked up and saw Diggby standing in the doorway, umbrella open above his head, debris bouncing off the black silk. Father Egan stared at him. "Major!" the priest shouted over the explosions. That thing won't do you much good against mortar shells. Diggby looked up at his umbrella, then back at the priest. He smiled, a genuine warm smile in the middle of the apocalypse. "Oh, I don't know, Father," he replied. "But what if it rains?" It was a joke, but it was also a weapon. Diggby understood the psychology of survival. If the men saw their commander cowering, they would break. If they saw him treating the SS Panzer divisions like a minor inconvenience, like a sudden downpour of rain, they would believe they could survive too. He wasn't just carrying an umbrella. He was carrying the collective sanity of the 2nd Battalion. By Wednesday, September 20th, the situation was critical. The British perimeter had shrunk to a handful of houses around the bridge ramp. The water supply had been cut. The men were drinking radiator water from destroyed trucks. Ammunition was so low that orders were given to fire only at confirmed targets. Every bullet had to kill a man. The Germans, frustrated by the stubborn resistance, decided to burn them out. They brought up tanks equipped with flamethrowers and incendiary shells. One by one, the houses defending the bridge were set on fire. The heat was intense. The air was thick with black, oily smoke that choked the lungs and stung the eyes. Digby's sector was under heavy attack. German infantry, supported by a Tiger tank, were pushing through the gardens, trying to overrun the British flank. The paratroopers were exhausted. They hadn't slept in 72 hours. They were filthy, bloodied, and pushed to the breaking point. They needed a miracle, or they needed a madman. Diggby saw the German infantry massing for a charge. He knew his men couldn't hold them off with rifle fire alone. They were too few, and their magazines were empty. He grabbed a bowler hat he had scavenged from a ruined house, a replacement for his beret, which had been lost in the fighting. He jammed it onto his head. It was too small, perched comically high, but it completed the look. He drew his revolver in one hand and raised the umbrella in the other. Right then, he shouted, his voice cutting through the din of battle. "Let's show them how the airborne does it. Fix bayonets." The order was electric. Bayonets clicked onto the ends of rifles. The men, seeing their major in a bowler hat and umbrella preparing to charge a tank division, felt a surge of adrenaline that overrode their fatigue. It was absurd. It was suicidal. It was perfect. Diggby blew a whistle. He vaulted over the garden wall, umbrella pointing the way. Charge. 30 screaming paratroopers followed him. They surged forward into the smoke. A terrifying wave of dirty, desperate men, led by a figure that looked like a banker late for work. The Germans were stunned. They expected the British to surrender or die in their holes. They didn't expect a bayonet charge led by Charlie Chaplin. The shock broke the German line. The paratroopers crashed into the infantry, fighting hand-to-hand with knives, rifle butts, and helmets. Diggby was in the thick of it, using his revolver to drop an SS officer and his umbrella to hook the legs of another, sending him sprawling into the dirt. They pushed the Germans back. They retook the garden. Against all odds, against all logic, they held the line. But courage alone couldn't stop the physics of war. The British were running out of time. By the morning of Thursday, September 21st, the 2nd Battalion was effectively destroyed. Colonel Frost had been severely wounded by shrapnel. The radio logs from that morning are heartbreaking. Out of ammo, God save the king. The houses were burning down around them. The wounded were trapped in the cellars, the heat becoming unbearable. Diggby took command of the remnants of the battalion. He organized the evacuation of the wounded from the burning buildings, moving them to a slightly safer position under the bridge ramp. But there was nowhere left to go. The Germans had completely encircled them. The tanks were now firing point blank into the ruins. At 9 hours, a ceasefire was arranged to evacuate the wounded. The Germans, to their credit, respected the white flag. They allowed the British to move their casualties, but as the smoke cleared, it was obvious the battle was over. The few survivors were rounded up. Diggby Tatham Wart was captured. He had fought for 4 days against overwhelming odds. He was exhausted. His uniform was torn. His face was black with soot, but he still had his umbrella. A German officer approached him. The German looked at the devastation, at the burning tanks the British had destroyed, at the piles of bodies. Then he looked at Diggby. He looked at the bowler hat. He looked at the umbrella. The German shook his head in disbelief. He couldn't reconcile the ferocity of the fighting with the eccentricity of the man standing before him. They stripped the prisoners of their weapons. They took the radios. They took the maps. But nobody thought to take the umbrella. To the Germans, it was just a stick, a piece of trash. They threw Diggby into a truck with the other officers and drove them to a holding area near Velp, just outside Arnhem. For most men, capture is the end of the story. The war is over. You survive the camps and wait for liberation. But Diggby wasn't most men. As he sat in the back of the truck, watching the ruins of Arnhem fade into the distance, he wasn't thinking about surrender. He was thinking about round 2. He was taken to St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which had been converted into a prisoner of war ward for the wounded. Diggby wasn't seriously injured, just battered and bruised. But he knew that the heavily guarded prisoner camps in Germany were a one-way ticket. If he was going to escape, he had to do it now before he was processed into the system. He began to act, not the action hero this time, but the invalid. He slumped his shoulders. He dragged his leg. He mumbled to himself. He played the part of a shell-shocked, broken officer. The German guards, overwhelmed with hundreds of critically wounded men, paid little attention to the quiet, dusty major in the corner. On the afternoon of his arrival, the hospital was chaotic. Doctors were rushing between beds, nurses were shouting orders, and guards were distracted by the sheer volume of suffering. Diggby saw his window, a second-story window to be precise. It was unguarded. It opened out onto a garden at the rear of the hospital. Below it, a drain pipe ran down the brick wall. It wasn't a staircase, but for a paratrooper, it was a highway. Diggby waited for the nurse to turn her back. He waited for the guard at the door to light a cigarette. Then he moved. The limp vanished. The exhaustion disappeared. He slipped through the window frame, grabbed the drain pipe, and slid down to the garden below. He hit the grass and rolled, staying low. He crawled through the shrubbery, moving toward the woods that bordered the hospital grounds. He was out, but he was alone. He was deep behind enemy lines, in a country swarming with SS patrols, with no weapon, no food, and no radio. And he was wearing a British uniform that made him a walking target. Most escapees would have tried to head south toward the Allied lines at Niemen. It was the logical choice, but Diggby knew the south would be blocked. The Germans would be expecting stragglers to head that way. The roads would be covered in checkpoints. So Diggby went deeper. He headed east, deeper into the forest, away from the front lines. He needed to find friends before he could find safety. He needed the Dutch resistance. Over the next few days, Diggby survived on apples and raw vegetables stolen from farms. He slept in ditches and barns, moving only at night. He used the stars to navigate, moving silently through the woods, avoiding the German patrols that were combing the area for survivors. On the 3rd night, he saw a light in a farmhouse window. It was a risk, a massive risk. The farmers could be collaborators. They could be terrified civilians who would turn him in to save their own families. But Diggby was starving. He knocked on the door. The farmer who opened it stared at the dirty, disheveled figure in the torn paratrooper smock. Diggby didn't speak Dutch. The farmer didn't speak English. Diggby pointed to his uniform, then to the woods. The farmer hesitated, then pulled him inside and locked the door. He had found the resistance. They gave him civilian clothes. They gave him food. They gave him a fake identity card. They told him he was now Peter Jansen, the deaf-mute son of a lawyer from Rotterdam. It was a good cover. It explained why he couldn't speak Dutch, and it explained why he wasn't in the army. But Diggby wasn't content with just hiding. As he sat in the safe house, listening to the reports coming in from the resistance fighters, he realized he wasn't the only one. The woods around Arnhem were full of British survivors, men who had missed the evacuation, men who had been cut off, men who were hiding in holes like animals waiting to be captured or killed. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Diggby looked at the Dutch resistance leader. "We can't just leave them," he said. "We have to get them out." The Dutchman shook his head. "Impossible. The Germans are everywhere. The Rhine is too wide. The patrols are too thick." Diggby smiled. It was the same smile he had given Father Egan during the mortar barrage. "Impossible is just a word," he said. "I disabled a tank with an umbrella. I think I can smuggle a few men across a river." He didn't want to just escape. He wanted to build an army. Diggby began to travel from safe house to safe house on a bicycle. A British major cycling through German-occupied Holland in broad daylight. Right under the noses of the SS, he gathered the scattered paratroopers. He organized them. He armed them with weapons scavenged from the battlefield. He created a secret base in the woods near Yde. It was a bold, terrifying plan. He wasn't hiding. He was occupying. He established a perimeter, set up sentries, and even conducted weapons training right in the middle of German territory. The Germans knew there were partisans in the woods, but they had no idea they were dealing with a coherent military unit commanded by a British officer. They thought they were hunting frightened stragglers. They didn't know they were being hunted by the man with the umbrella. By mid-October, Diggby had collected 138 men, soldiers, pilots, engineers. Men who had given up hope were now part of a disciplined unit again. But keeping 138 men hidden in a forest was a ticking time bomb. Winter was coming. The leaves were falling, destroying their cover. The Germans were tightening the noose. Diggby knew they had one shot, one chance to break out. They had to cross the lower Rhine River and link up with the Allied forces on the other side. It was a suicide mission. The river was guarded. The banks were mined. If they were spotted, it would be a massacre. He called it Operation Pegasus. On the night of October 22, 1944, Diggby gathered his men in a clearing. They were a ragtag army. Some wore British uniforms. Some wore Dutch overalls. Some had rifles. Some had nothing but knives. Diggby stood before them. He wasn't wearing his bowler hat anymore, but he still had that air of invincible calm. "Tonight," he whispered, "we go home. Silence is our armor. Darkness is our shield. Follow me." He turned and led them into the trees, toward the river, toward the German lines, toward the impossible. But as they moved through the darkness, a sound froze them in their tracks. A German patrol, voices, boots crunching on leaves. They were heading directly for the column of escapees. Diggby signaled for the men to freeze. He gripped the handle of his weapon. Not an umbrella this time, but a Sten gun. The patrol was close. 20 yard, 10 yard. The beam of a flashlight swept across the trees. The beam stopped. It illuminated the face of a British soldier crouching behind a log. The German shouted. A rifle bolt clicked. Diggby didn't hesitate. He stepped out of the shadows, raising his weapon. The element of surprise was gone. The stealth mission was over. Now it was a fight for survival. The German rifle bolt clicked. In the silence of the forest, it sounded like a cannon shot. The beam of the flashlight swept over the British paratrooper, freezing behind the log. Diggby didn't fire. He didn't scream. He knew that one gunshot would bring the entire German army down on top of them. Instead, he stepped out of the darkness, not as a soldier, but as a shadow. The German patrol leader hesitated. He saw a silhouette. He saw the outline of a British officer. But before he could shout the alarm, the darkness behind him moved. Two resistance fighters, moving with the silence of ghosts, emerged from the brush. Knives flashed. There was a brief struggle, the sound of boots scuffling on dirt, and then silence returned to the woods. Diggby signaled to his column. "Move now." They had evaded the patrol, but the clock was ticking. They were 3 miles from the Rye River. 138 men, British paratroopers, American pilots, Dutch guides. They moved in a single file line, each man holding the coattail of the man in front of him so they wouldn't get lost in the pitch black. They had wrapped their boots in rags to muffle the sound of their footsteps. They greased their equipment to stop it from rattling. They were a ghost army, marching right through the heart of the German defensive line. At 23 hours, they reached the riverbank. The Rhine was wide, dark, and terrifyingly fast. On the other side lay freedom. On this side, the German machine gun posts were less than 200 YD away. Diggby moved to the water's edge. He took out a flashlight with a red lens. He aimed it across the black water and flashed a signal. V for victory. ... Dash. He waited 10 seconds, 20 seconds. Nothing. Had the message been received? Had the mission been compromised? The wind bit through their thin uniforms. The men were shivering, not just from cold, but from the adrenaline that comes at the end of a long, desperate race. Then out of the darkness, a shape emerged from the water. A boat. Then another. Then another. The American 101st Airborne Division and Canadian engineers were on the south bank. They had seen the signal. They had launched a fleet of small canvas assault boats into the current. Diggby turned to his men. Right then, he whispered, "Orderly fashion. No pushing. It's time to go." The evacuation was a masterclass in discipline. Under the nose of the German sentries, 138 men waded into the freezing mud and climbed into the boats. The paddles dipped silently into the water. The boats disappeared into the mist. Diggby waited until the last man was aboard. He was the commander. The captain goes down with the ship, and the major leaves the battlefield last. He climbed into the final boat. As they pushed off, a German flare popped into the sky, illuminating the river in a ghostly white light. Machine guns opened up from the north bank. Tracers zipped over the water, but it was too late. The boats hit the south bank. Hands reached out to pull them up. American accents welcomed them. Cigarettes were lit. Coffee was poured. They had made it. Operation Pegasus was a success. Diggby Tatham Wart had led the largest evasion of Allied personnel in the entire war. He had gone in with an umbrella, fought a tank division, escaped a hospital, built a secret army in the woods, and walked them all home. When Diggby reported to British headquarters the next morning, the staff officer stared at him. Diggby was filthy. His uniform was in shreds. He hadn't bathed in weeks, but he was alive. The officer asked, "Major, do you have anything to report?" Diggby looked at him, then touched his chin. "Yes," he said. "I'm afraid I'm late for a shave." Diggby Tatham Wart survived the war. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his actions at Arnhem. But the story of the umbrella didn't end there. In fact, it became a legend that was almost too good to be believed. Years later, when Hollywood decided to make the epic movie A Bridge Too Far, they hired Diggby as a technical consultant. He walked the actors through the battle. He explained the tactics. He told them about the bridge, the tanks, the desperation, and he told them about the umbrella. The screenwriters listened, the producers listened, and then they made a decision. They cut the umbrella out of the script. The character based on Diggby, played by actor Edward Fox, carried a walking stick instead. Why? Because the producers said that modern audiences would simply not believe it. They thought it looked too fake, Too Hollywood, too ridiculous. The truth was stranger than fiction. The reality of Diggby Tatham Wart was too wild for the movies. Diggby moved to Kenya after the war. He bought a farm. He lived a quiet life far away from the noise of mortars and machine guns. He rarely spoke about the war. He didn't brag about the tank he disabled. He didn't boast about the lives he saved. But those who knew him said he never lost that spark, that glint in his eye that said, no matter how bad the storm gets, you just have to open your umbrella and keep walking. Diggby died in 1993 at the age of 75, but his legacy isn't just in the history books. It's in the idea that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments of human history, there is room for style, there is room for humor, and there is room for the kind of courage that doesn't just fight the enemy, but mocks the very idea of fear itself. He taught us that a soldier isn't defined by the size of his gun, but by the size of his spirit. And sometimes the most dangerous weapon on the battlefield isn't a tank or a rifle. It's a 14 O's piece of silk and wood held by a man who refuses to let the world rain on his parade. If this story blew your mind, you're in the right place. This is WW2 Missing Pages, and we are dedicated to digging up the stories that history books forgot and movies were too scared to show. Do not let this story end here. Hit that subscribe button right now. Click the bell icon. We have an archive full of forgotten heroes, insane escapes, and impossible battles coming your way every single week. And I want to hear from you. Go to the comments section below and tell me, if you were dropping into Arnhem with the SS waiting for you, what is the one useless item you would bring for good luck? Would it be an umbrella, a deck of cards? Let me know. Thank you for watching WW2 Missing Pages. Keep the history alive.